Welcome, travelers. The lights are dimming, but the story remains. Tonight, we drift across the forgotten world of Skyrim, where snow whispers through ancient pines, and time sleeps beneath the stone. This is not a timeline. It is a retelling, shaped from truth, but spoken like legend. The night is long. The fire is low. Let us begin. The wind-scarred steps of High Hrothgar, just below the first stone tablet. The sky holds its breath, and so does the world. The mountain does not speak. It has not spoken in a long time. Snow flurries drift like lost ashes over the stone path carved into the throat of the world. The ice underfoot is older than language. It remembers when the skies cracked with words that could shatter bone, bend time, break oaths. But those days are sealed in frost. The wind, today, only whispers. A snow fox halts mid-step, nose twitching, ears back. The fur on its nape bristles, not at a scent, not at a sound, but something older, the kind of silence that leans forward. Above it, a monk's hood shifts, one of the Greybeards, veiled in wool the color of smoke. He does not speak. None of them do. Their silence is not absence. It is reverence, containment, a vault that would rupture the slope if opened wrongly. They have felt it stirring for days now. The sky has grown tin-bitter, a metallic edge in the clouds, like breath drawn over a blade. Something old is waking. Stillness builds, then a tremor, soft as a cough, but wrong. The kind of wrong that vibrates in the marrow. Low across the mountain a shout rolls, not voice, not wind, but something between, syllables flung by a force older than both. It does not echo, but it does answer. Snow shakes loose from high eaves. One of the stone tablets, the first, catches the sound. Runes on its face, long dulled by frost, glow faintly gold, then fade. A breath has crossed, a soft threshold broken. The Greybeards do not kneel, they do not move, but something in their posture lowers, the slight curve of shoulders long unbent, a ritual of recognition, as silent as it is sacred. From the far forests below, where pine creaks under too much snow and smoke from unseen hearths curls into the air, something watches, not a person, not quite, but something that sees the break and remembers its meaning. Something that has waited. The mountain feels it. The hinge has turned. The wind clawed at the naked peaks of Atmora long before men had names, before cities, before oaths, before war. In that wild before world, breath was not yet sacred. It was survival, raw, ragged, torn from lungs blackened by the cold. The clans who endured there did not speak, not truly. Their mouths gave sound, yes, hoarse, desperate bursts of guttural meaning, caught between bone cracks and storm. But they did not yet know the shape of words. Not yet. Not until the sky bled fire, and a goddess dared breathe into mortal throat. At the world's rim, where blizzards howled with the hunger of wolves long dead, Atmorans screamed to live. They screamed into the wind to keep warm. They screamed at the night to keep sane. They screamed because if they stopped, they would vanish, and the snow would not remember them. In that time, the world was made of edges, glacier cliffs that fell into storm-thick sea, bone spears of ice that jutted from cave mouths like the jaws of the earth, war axes that cleaved silence more often than flesh. Fires were small, graves were not. And yet they endured. Jorund of the Bare Hearth howled first, not because he was brave, not because he was strong, but because he was the last of his blood, and the blizzard had taken his axe hand. Wrapped in pelt and stubbornness, Jorund bared his teeth to the sky and gave his final breath in a shout that defied forgetting. It cracked ice. It startled mammoths. It was not magic, but it was close. Others heard, not just men. The mountain listened. So did Kine. The Nords would later call her Mother of Storms, Shout-Giver, Wind-Womb. But then she was only a whisper in the gale, a god whose sorrow moved clouds. Watching them struggle, her heart did not harden. It broke. She descended not in form, but in wind. And when her breath touched a dying man's lungs, not to take, but to teach, the world changed. That was when the silence cracked. It began with a sound that was not a word, but it was shaped like one, a sound that the world leaned into. Jorund did not survive. But when his corpse was found, his mouth was open, frozen in an exhale that left frost on the rocks. Runes now call it the first shout. It split a boulder nearby with no hand. The Bare Hearth mourners did not speak at his pyre, but the next time snow blinded the passes, they shouted, and it cleared. It did not begin with war. It began with stone. Stone that cracked, not beneath a hammer, not from frost, from voice. A girl, no more than 12 winters, stood atop a cliff edge with her dead brother's name still warm in her throat. She did not mean to shout. She meant to wail, but the name broke loose with the weight of a promise instead of grief. And the mountains below her trembled. The wind stole her breath. The stone split in two. Below, wolves scattered like thrown embers. The air turned red with startled birds, and the wind did not howl back. It listened, reverently, as though a temple had been opened. That was how it began, not with prophecy nor ritual, with a name shouted in mourning that split a cliff, and so it spread. Others began to try, quietly at first, alone in ravines, on ridgelines, not in words, for words were still crude things, shaped more by fist than tongue, but in syllables torn from the ribs like sharpened bone. The gods had not warned them. No scroll declared what was now possible. But Kine had breathed once, and that was enough. Those who could make the air break were called tongues. Their names would outlive cities. The first to forge the voice into more than accident was Halig the Scar-Browed, smith of the Stoneword. When he shouted, the snow did not melt. It lifted, spiraled, and then laid itself down around him like armor. Lock, not just snow. Sky snow. Living snow. Commanded. Others watched him walk through a blizzard with no cloak. They began to believe that breath could build. That was the fracture. The moment the voice became intention. No longer mourning. No longer accident. Power. Not all were pleased. Clans who had ruled by blade watched their sons fall silent before a woman who could shout fire from her ribs. Elders who claimed wisdom by age found their counsel overruled by children whose lungs could bend wolves to heel. Wars began, but they were not won with swords. They were lost with syllables. The old ways shattered like frost under heel. A breath had become blade, and yet even this was not the true break. The fracture tore widest when the first stone was carved. Not with hands, with voice. It was Corvair Raventooth who stood before the cliffside and spoke the mountain into memory. "Hear," she said, but not with common tongue, with the Thuum, the true voice, and the stone obeyed. It shaped her memory into form, a glyph, etched deeper than any chisel could reach, not scratched into surface, sung into the marrow of the rock. The mountain carried her grief, her triumph, her vow. It carried meaning, and others followed. Soon, tablets dotted the high paths, not written in ink, written in breath, each word a gifted wound, given shape by a throat willing to pay the price. The first word, walls. Some screamed themselves hoarse trying to match them. Others died. Because the truth was this: not all breath was worthy. Only those who gave more than they took could shape the air. Only those who remembered kind sorrow and carried it. The fracture was not an explosion. It was a ripple, but by the time it reached the coasts, the world had changed. Now stone speaks. Now snow listens. Now the air is alive with vow. In the beginning, the voice was a weapon. Then it became language, and then it became world. When the clans realized the Thuum could do more than destroy, that it could shape, bind, bless, a new age began. The first thing they built with it was not a city, it was a memory, a gathering place high in the reach where voices had cracked the cliffs and made hollows in the stone. There, the first tongues stood in a circle of echo and declared a word not yet known. Hroth, peace. They shouted it, together, not at a foe, at the air itself. And the air responded, stilling, warming slightly, holding silence like a child. It became law. When the voice is raised in unity, no blood shall follow. They called these places word rings, not temples, not fortresses, mouthless circles where memory settled and power softened. A child brought into a word ring would not cry. The wind lulled them. Old warriors laid their blades at the center and spoke of battles with voices hoarse from reverence, not rage. And from these rings, the first songs were born, not ballads, song lore, spoken not for rhyme, but remembrance. Each syllable a step back through what the breath had built. The world bent to the voice. Mists parted when shouted to. Trees twisted to lean from a path when asked. Rivers slowed, not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, when a tongue bade them give safe crossing. The very air grew responsive. But for all the wonder, there came caution. For some, shouts came without intent. Children born during this age of new shaping sometimes cried and cracked stone. A woman whispered a lullaby and shattered her cottage beams. A man swore in grief and woke a landslide. The voice, now awakened, would not return to slumber. Thus came the first binding, the rule that no mortal may speak a true word without price. The elders formed a council of tongues to track which shouts had been carved into the air and which were yet too wild. Each new word was earned through ritual, sacrifice, or service. It was no longer enough to feel. One had to prove worth to speak. Some rebelled, fled to carve their own glyphs in secret valleys. Others embraced silence, fearing even breath. But most learned to carry the voice like a blade sheathed behind the teeth, drawn only when needed, and always with purpose. And then came engraving. Before, shouts were temporary, powerful but passing. Now, some could be set, frozen into places like echoes that did not fade. The first to do this was Velkrin of the Rime Mask, who carved Teed, time, into a glacier. The ice ceased its melt. For 50 years, that glacier did not yield a drop. The scholars did not call this magic. They called it covenant, a contract between breath and world. So began the era of voice forging, not of weapons, but of places, caves that whispered warnings to trespassers, cliffs that wept in rhythm to remembered funerals, a valley where every sunrise sang a child's name, long lost. The world became a chronicler, the air an archive. The new shape was not merely power. It was memory made solid. It was faith enforced by echo. Children born now were taught not first to speak, but to listen. Before they named their mothers, they were shown the stones that held their ancestors' breath, and they understood. Speech is a shaping. Words are wounds that the world keeps. In this era, even silence gained weight. When a tongue fell quiet, it was not weakness, it was discipline, the restraint of a god-blooded throat, choosing not to command. The wind remembers. Even when men forget, when kingdoms crumble into their own legends, when battle cries rust in the throats of cowards and kings alike, the air still carries the shape of old breath. Across the high steps of Skyrim, snow falls differently where the first tongues walked. You cannot see it. You can only feel it. A stillness in the flake, a hesitation in the gust, as if even the storm knows this is sacred ground. Those first shouts carved not just stone, not just weather, but expectation. The world now listens. Children dream of names they've never heard, syllables shaped in sleeping mouths. Wolves pause at thresholds unseen. Even dragons, when they returned, sought first the winds that tasted of ancient vows. What remains is not a relic. It is a debt, a silence held by the sky, atop high Hrothgar, where the oldest of the Greybeards sit in stillness. No voice rises, not out of fear, not reverence, out of reminder. Each of them carries within their ribs the weight of untold storms, not because they are feared, but because they are entrusted. Their silence is vow, not vacancy. Occasionally, a traveller climbs to their doors, seeking truth or thunder. They are met not with riddles, nor fire, but with breath, measured, calm. Each inhale a memory, each exhale a warning. The world has not yet forgotten how to shout, but it chooses not to. That is what remains. And in the deep, the bones of those first tongues rest beneath cairns built from stones once split by their own shouts. No tombs, no names carved in metal, only the wind above, occasionally breaking into rhythm that almost resembles a word. But the voice has passed on, not extinguished, transmuted. Now it sleeps in the blood of smiths, the lips of poets, the breath of a child who hums at the edge of a fjord and makes the waves lean in. The Thu'um is no longer just for war. It is reminder, it is inheritance, and every breath drawn by the Nords of Skyrim carries a weight they do not always recognize, a covenant, unspoken, but felt. The sky has not shouted since, but it listens, and it waits, not for a return, but for the next shape. There was a time when Skyrim was only echo. Its holds had no names, only warnings whispered into mead foam and battle scars. The hearths of the north were scattered, drifting embers among frost-bitten fields, each clan clinging to memory like a wounded thing. The land itself felt unsettled, not untamed, wounded, as if it had once been struck by a great grief, and had not yet stopped bleeding under the snow. Before Ysgramor, there were voices without vow, Jarl kings who reigned only until the next mead spilled, until the next oar struck land, until a stronger arm bent their name into ruin. They built mead halls on cracked stone, not from reverence, from defiance. Their banners were not raised in unison, but torn from the hides of conquered cousins. Steel was not forged with honor, but with remembrance of betrayal. They sang only when drunk. They carved only to mark victory. Their gods came to them in thunderstorms, not temples, and the land echoed them back, fractured, fireless, listening only to its own bitter wind. Among these drifting hearths was one unlike the rest, not because it was larger, not richer, not soaked in more blood, because it remembered. The hearth of Jehen, the last teller burned low, but steady. In her smoke-choked hall, words were passed, not as command, but as binding. She did not shout, nor sing, nor drink from skull-cups, but each night she placed one stone beside her fire and spoke a single name into it, not of gods, but of kin. When snow buried her roof, she dug with bare hands. When raiders came, she did not call for steel. She handed her stones to the youngest, and they fled with her memory. Years later, when Ysgramor would raise his first pillar hold, one of those stones would be buried at its base, and it would be warm to the touch. This is the age before Ysgramor's sword, but not before his purpose. The land already ached for him. Far across the sea of ghosts, whispers of Atmora's ruin had not yet arrived. Skyrim's coastlines bristled with watchers. Raiding ships came from black waters, flying wolfskin flags and stinking of smoked eel. They did not conquer. They tested. Each winter brought new names: Skuldir of the Red Breath, Haldron One Brow, Skarn the Bone-Ringed, but none remained. Skyrim swallowed them, or spat them out. Because Skyrim, then, was not a country. It was a quarrel-made land. Each hold distrusted the next. Salt was traded for iron with drawn blades and turned backs. The few who tried to build peace were buried under distrust, thicker than snowdrifts. It was not a lack of courage. It was a lack of story. No uniting tale, no shared wound, no oath strong enough to hold. What they needed was not just a king. They needed a forge for memory, one that burned hotter than vengeance, but cooler than pride. The world was waiting for Ysgramor, but first it would take something from him. When he came, not yet myth, not yet mountain-hearted, it was not with fire. It was with ashes. His voice did not declare conquest. It carried the echo of the night of tears. The sea brought him back, yes, but what Skyrim did not know, what even the gods held their breath to see, was that Ysgramor had not returned to claim. He had returned to remember, and that remembering would split the land like an axe through oak. The sea did not part for him. It spat him out, coughing brine and blood, the screams of lost kin still clawing at the edges of his hearing. Ysgramor returned, not with triumph, but with grief sharpened into oath. Behind him, Atmora lay in smouldering ruin, not burned by flame, but by betrayal, greed, and the gods' final silence. The north had collapsed under its own weight. Too many kings, too few memories worth keeping. So he came to Skyrim, not to start anew, but to reclaim what had been lost. But even before his boots found the old snow, the night of tears still bled. The razing of Sarthal was no simple slaughter. It was a wound, deliberate and lasting. The elves struck not only to drive back men, but to erase. They burned archives, they shattered tombstones, they salted memory, and worst of all, they stole the artifact that the Nords had only begun to understand. The Eye. No one yet knew what it truly was, but they knew it watched, and it remembered, which made it dangerous. Ysgramor arrived to silence. No song of welcome, no victory horn, only the smell of ash and the stench of deliberate forgetting. He knelt in the bones of his son and wept until his beard froze to his chest. Then slowly he stood and spoke one name into the frost. Wuthrad. It was not yet a blade. It was a vow. He gathered the survivors, not with command, but with story. He did not say, "Follow me." He said, "Do you remember?" And they did. Thus began the forging, not of steel, but of memory into weapon. They returned across the Sea of Ghosts, not as wanderers, but as companions. Not one clan, not one hold, but bound by shared wound and shared will. Each warrior bore a scar and a name they refused to let vanish. Each carried stone-etched oaths in their packs, ready to bury beneath each new stronghold. But they did not only fight elves, they fought Skyrim itself. The land did not welcome unity. Old Jarls declared Ysgramor a pretender. Tongues bound to older gods spat at his feet. Wolves that walked like men watched from the dark tree line with ancient hunger. And still they carved forward. Each battle was a story stone, named and planted. Each mead hall raised was an oath made visible. And then came the true fracture. In the ruins of Sarthal, beneath layers of fire-fused stone and weeping earth, they found glyphs not made by man or myrrh. They glowed faintly when touched. They responded to certain words. They hummed with the cadence of lost gods. Ysgramor knelt again, as he had in ash, but this time he carved, not wept. He placed his palm upon the stone and said, "We remember." And the wall answered back, not with sound, with light, not with language, with recognition. The world shifted, not because of the elves, not because of war, because memory had become sacred, and Skyrim would never be ruled by fear again. It would be ruled by remembrance. Steel remembers differently than stone. Stone endures. Steel responds, and as Ysgramor's companions swept across Skyrim, they learned to speak with both. No longer simple raiders or shattered clans, they became something deliberate, oath forgers, sworn to bind the broken into shape. Each blade they carried bore runes not for power, but for vow. Each blow struck in battle echoed, not just with rage, but reminder. You burned our past, then we carve it back into the world with fire and metal. Thus rose the pillar holds. Unlike the transient mead halls of old, these stood with ritual purpose. They were not just strongholds. They were story houses, built where blood had been spilled for cause, and grief had found shape. Foundations were laid with naming rights, bricks sealed with the spoken names of the dead, each stone a memory pressed into place. These holds were not walls against enemies. They were walls against forgetting. Inside, every weapon had a history, every hearth a reason. Even the ale bore stories, brewed to honor the fallen, named after a remembered vow, its foam raised not just in revelry, but in recognition. The companions did not write laws, they forged them into ritual. The greatest of these rites was the blood circle. When a new warrior joined their ranks, they did not pledge to Ysgramor, they pledged to the blade, not to wield it, but to honor its story. They cut a thin line across their palm, letting the blood fall on the hilt of a companion's weapon, and spoke aloud the name of one they'd lost. Not as an oath to avenge, but as a promise to remember. If they could not name such a one, they were not ready. Because the companions were not made from strength, they were made from grief, reforged into loyalty. And then came Wuthrad. No longer just vow, it became steel, forged from a meteor that fell during the red moon. Blacksmiths claimed the ore resisted all heat until Ysgramor himself laid his breath upon it. The blade took not a shape, but a memory, carved not by hammer alone, but with the combined shouts of the senior companions. Each rune was sung into the weapon, syllables binding the past into the edge. It was not sharper than other axes, but it never dulled, because it fed not on blood, but on story. And stories, as Ysgramor taught, do not fade if held rightly. Soon, across the land, others mimic the forging, not with steel, with architecture, with runes, with ritual. A Jarl would not be crowned, unless his name was sung by 3 companions who knew it by heart. New cities bore not the names of conquerors, but of fallen kin. Even the simplest fire pit might be ringed in stones, marked by the breath names of the family who first lit it. The land had begun to carry its people. Skyrim, for the first time, became cohesive, not through domination, through shared wound and the will to remember better. The new shape was this, memory as mortar. Blood and blade alone had failed the North once. Ysgramor ensured they would never again stand unanchored. Now, every stone raised a voice. Every story found its place, not to be praised, to be preserved. The sea still whispers of him, not in waves, not in tide, in wake. Ysgramor's ships have long since rotted, the sails devoured by storm, the wood swallowed by barnacle and salt, but the roots they carved remain, followed by fisher folk who've never heard his name, but instinctively steer by stars he once named in grief. His holdfasts are buried deep now, beneath cities grown fat on easier peace, but the foundations still warm to certain names. And Vuthrad, the axe that drinks story instead of blood, still hums when passed over old stone, not from memory, from recognition. In the wind district of Whiterun, children toss pebbles at a blackened obelisk. Most do not know the words carved into it, old Nord glyphs, long replaced by market chatter and soldier march. But those who press their ear to its side swear they hear drumming, faint, like a heart-beating inside stone. Hammer ring, forge rhythm. They do not know. It is the last standing stone of the first pillar hold, the place where companions once bled their names into wall mortar to hold back forgetting. But the stone remembers, and it listens. Not every companion's name is known, but that was never the point. Theirs was a legacy of loss remembered, not fame retained. Their victory was not in conquest, but in the refusal to let fire become ash without story. To this day, the mead brewed beneath Jorvaska carries a smoky undertone, not from wood, from the ritual burning of oaths before each new season of war. The smoke curls into the rafters, binds with the old bones of the ceiling, settles into the skin of the elders. They call it the weight of loyalty. No one drinks before the telling, and in secret, in snow-choked shrines where no one dares plant a banner, a few grey-robed elders still mark the stone of memory, an obsidian slab kept warm with chanting breath, one name added each year by flame-etched runes. The ritual is simple. A tale is spoken, a silence is held, and the name is cut, not written. Once per generation, the stone cracks slightly wider, never in the same place. They say the day it breaks clean in two, Skyrim will have finally forgotten. But that day is not today, because we remember, because they remembered first. What remains is not just ruin, it is a rhythm, a cadence of stone, steel, and vow, passed mouth to mouth, scar to scar, hold to hold. Even now, when a Nord lifts a blade before battle, some still speak not to gods, but to memory. Let me fall with my name held rightly. Let my blood speak louder than my fear. They do not shout it, they whisper it, and the wind carries it on, just as it carried Ysgramor's first vow across a burning sea. Skyrim still stands, because it was built from oath. Time, before it fractured, did not march. It knelt to the dragons, not in haste, not in fear, but in reverence twisted into rule. There was an age when every breath drawn by man was measured against flame-born law, not yet tyranny, not yet madness, but myth, worn as crown. The dragon priests stood tall in temple shadow, their skin no longer quite their own. Scales did not cover their arms, but obedience did. They bore masks not to hide, but to bind, faces carved in draconic honor, souls shackled in eternal vow. Each temple was a lung of the land, exhaling doctrine, incense coiled like memory, slow burning and sacred. The air was thick with truth, shaped by claw, truth that did not bend, truth that devoured question. The gods were not absent, they were overhead. coiling through cloud banks, landing on peaks, watching the world with slit pupil patience, not ruling, judging. In that time, the Thuum was reserved, not forbidden, but leashed. Mortal tongues could shape flame, yes, could bend the wind, but only when sanctioned, only when granted syllables from on high. The shouts were chained like sacred beasts, doled out by temple decree. A farmer might be granted reek, power, but never strewn, storm, and never teed. Time was theirs alone, and they guarded it jealously. There were those who whispered that the dragons had not created time, only claimed it, that the Elder Scrolls, kept hidden even then, whispered of other shapes, other flows, but to read one was death, or worse, to walk forward and find no ground beneath the next moment. The dragon priests warned, to bend time is to betray the flame that birthed you. And so the people obeyed, not because they were weak, because they were survivors, better to bow than to unmake the sun. In the deep reaches of Skyrim, where wind howls across ice plateaus, untouched by hoof or claw, there stood a shrine that no one tended, not to a god, not to a hero, to a moment, the moment before a shout, that held breath, that pause. Pilgrims came not to pray, but to become still, to remember that before all flame, before all power, there was silence, and that silence contains choice. Even the dragon priests, it is said, feared this place, not for what it held, but for what it refused to hold. No mask ever lasted there. They cracked. This was the world before the hinge shattered. Time moved forward. Dragons ruled not just the sky, but meaning. The tongue was theirs, and the silence beneath it was theirs to command. But then, one mortal dreamt of tomorrow, and spoke it without permission, and the world tilted. The sky did not fall. It paused. A single beat of silence stretched across horizon and heartbeat and breath until it groaned and tore. It began not with rebellion, not with battle. It began with a question. Aren't we already living tomorrow? The question was whispered by Chalra Halfsight, a scribe assigned a temple counting, keeper of ink and dust and days. Her duty was to chart the dragon's calendar, circular, unchanging, perfect, no seasons, no deviation. Each month etched in bone, sealed with scale. But Kjalra, half blind from birth, began to see double, not with her eyes, with her moments. She woke once, before she slept. She bled before the wound. She watched her own hand write a rune she had not yet learned, and she spoke of it, not in fear, in wonder. That was her sin. The dragon priest came swiftly. Her tongue was bound in ash, her hands sealed in wax, but her voice had already entered the air, and it lingered. Others began to feel it. Subtle shifts, an hour repeating, a harvest spoiling before planted. Memories of conversations that hadn't yet occurred. The temples called it blessing, a proximity to divine perception, but the people called it by another name, Kjalra's knot. Time had curled. And then came Alduin, not with fire, with hunger. He did not descend in rage. He appeared in absence, a shadow where a morning should have been. One day, the sun simply did not rise. No storm, no eclipse, only pause, then screams, then void. Not death, something worse. People disappeared from memory. Entire families, no bones, no ashes, only space. Histories rewritten without them, names misremembered, oaths half-finished. They said Alduin devoured tomorrow, not as revenge, as ritual. He had done it before. He would do it again. The dragon priests could not explain it, so they hid. They sealed their temples, wrapped their glyphs in silence, forbade all shouting save for rituals of appeasement. The voice, once sacred, became a threat. But it was too late. The knot had tightened. Moments tangled. Time did not flow. It looped, doubled, frayed. Some men aged backward. Some saw their deaths in dream and could not escape them. Others began to speak in verbs that had not yet occurred. The world was fevered. And in the chaos, the tongues, the true ones, silent for generations, returned. They had waited in caves, waited in wordlessness, watched the dragons forget humility. Now they spoke dragon back to them, not as prayer, as challenge. The first true shout was not for battle. It was Teed Cree Loon, time, kill, leech. A shout to bleed the knot, to force flow back into the wheel. It worked, partially. Time did not heal, but it fractured clean. Moments split like stone under too many chisel strikes. Futures piled atop pasts, and in that chaos, the dragons faltered. This was the first dragon break. No longer myth, no longer rumor. The world itself became a contradiction, and Alduin, in that confusion, was cast adrift. Not killed, not sealed, skipped. Time did not mend. It relearned itself. Like a shattered jaw finding new muscle, crooked, aching, still able to bite. The world moved forward, but not in a straight line. It spiraled, bled sideways, flinched from memory. In the wake of the first dragon break, the sky seemed shy. Days passed, but no one trusted them. Moons stuttered in their cycle. Some called it an age, others called it a scar. A few, the ones who still dreamed in smoke and runes, called it a lesson. The lesson was this: no crown is eternal, not even on the brow of time. The temples fell not with screams, but with laughter, not mocking, not joyous, relieved. When the walls cracked and the dragon masks shattered, some priests cried. Others removed their helms, exhaled dust, and whispered thanks. They had been held too long in borrowed breath. Some turned to the mountains and vanished. Others gave their final shout into the sky and turned to ash. A pact fulfilled. And from their ruins, songs began. Crude at first, disjointed, rhythms bent by memory, not melody. But they carried one truth forward. The world could be spoken into freedom. The tongues emerged, not all at once, not as an army, as ripples. A woman in the rift who sang storms to sleep. A child in Yarlmarch who spoke the word for wall and split a canyon open. A smith in Markarth who breathed into a furnace and made it burn for 12 days. They did not take the title, tongue lightly. They did not claim power. They bore remembrance. Their voices did not rule. They healed, warned, rebuilt. They called themselves echo binders, those who stitched torn chronology back into usable rhythm. But even they could not seal the scar. That task fell to the scroll watchers, scribes who had hidden during the chaos, guarding the elder scrolls in vaults so deep even time could not touch them. They emerged trembling, eyes white with ink burn and vision, holding truths no mouth could form. They said, time could not be restored, but it could be anchored. And so they forged rituals of weight, moments too heavy to be dislodged by further breakage, birthrights sealed with dragonbone, funerals sung in mirrored languages, contracts bound not in ink, but in echoed syllables that reverberated across days. They did not control time. They convinced it, stay, please, stay. And time, still reeling from its own fracture, listened. From all this, the world gained a new logic, that the flow of events is not owed, it is earned, that calendars must be written with care, and names must be spoken with intention, and no prophecy is owed obedience. And in the center of this new shape, Kialra returned, not unchanged, her eyes blind, her breath slowed, her voice forever echoing 3 syllables behind. But she smiled, because she had once seen a day arrive before it was born, and she knew now that time does not belong to the dragons. It belongs to those who remember it rightly. The scar does not fade. Even now, if you climb the old paths beyond Skyhaven, there are places where snow falls in reverse. Not every day, not predictably, but just enough to remind you that the world cracked once, and the seam was never stitched clean. Time flows again, yes, but it limps. It favors the old wound, the place where Alduin bit through the hinge of continuity and spat out everything that didn't burn. The people remember, even if they say they don't. A mother lights a candle 3 times, then snuffs it once. Her child asks why. She does not know, only that her grandmother did, and that the days feel straighter when the flame follows that rhythm. A farmer stacks stones in a spiral before planting, not for the soil, for the hourglass buried beneath it, broken by age, left unturned. A bard plays a song backwards once each year, just once, always on the same day, always on a high hill. No one listens, the wind does. And in the chambers beneath the white gold tower, locked behind seals of script and shout, the elder scrolls still hum, not loudly, just enough to keep the scribes awake at night, enough to stain the margins of history with questions too dangerous to ask. One scroll bears no writing anymore, only a single line, burned into the edge where parchment curls inward. Tid Clo Ul. Time, sand, eternity. A warning or a promise. No one is sure anymore. What remains is uncertainty, not as fear but as faith. The knowledge that the world is not inevitable, that continuity is a kindness, not a guarantee, that tomorrow is not owed, that today is chosen, and that dragons can be gods, yes, but even gods must bow when mortals remember the shape of freedom. The temples are ruins now, their masks buried or worn by fools. But the air still bears a bitter charge, especially in early morning, before the sun remembers to rise, as if something ancient, something left out of time, still lingers, still watches, still waits. But there is no terror in that waiting, only rhythm, a breath drawn, a syllable unspoken, a silence that listens back. The hinge has cracked, but the wheel turns on. The dragons had names for their victories, but they did not name their peace. It stretched, heavy and smothering, across the mountain thrones and the sky paths, a silence shaped like fear. After the dragon break, after time knotted and bled and barely reformed, the dragons did not fall. They lingered. Some vanished into shadow and mountain smoke. Others stalked the high winds, trailing silence behind them like cloak-tattered kings. They no longer devoured time. They occupied it, their wings beating a rhythm mortals dared not disturb. Skyrim survived, but it did not stand. Its halls were muted. The old word walls no longer echoed. Scroll keepers turned their faces away from the sky. The Thu'um, once the spine of the land, lay buried in stone and shame. The voice had returned the world to rhythm, but that rhythm now marched beneath talons. And the tongues, they disappeared. Not slain, not silenced, withdrawn, some to caves deeper than echo, some to mountain tops higher than gods, and some into themselves, sealing their shouts behind lips that no longer dared shape flame. They feared what the world had become, not because it was ruled, but because it was unchanged. Alduin had been cast from the moment, but the moment had not moved. It was Paarthurnax who first broke that stillness. The others called him traitor, long before he earned it. A dragon, yes. Brother to Alduin, born of fire, fluent in end times. But something had entered his breath during the break. A crack, a hesitation. Where Alduin had bitten through time, Paarthurnax had inhaled the wound, and found it bitter. He withdrew from the sky, perched atop the throat of the world, and waited. He listened for the next shout, but none came, so he began to speak alone. The Greybeards did not seek him. They found him by weather. Snow refused to settle where his words drifted. Birdsong mimicked syllables no animal should know, and high above the 9th tablet one could feel the air hum, not with power, but with possibility. The monks came barefoot. They came without weapons. They came with ears open and mouths closed, and Paarthurnax taught, not with command, with question. What is power, if not mastered? What is breath, if not bridled? Below, the world still feared dragons, but atop the throat, for the first time, a dragon bent its head to teach. And the men who listened did not build temples, they built discipline. They did not shout, they breathed. And in that breath, the voice began again. Not as weapon, not as rebellion, but as choice. The age before the shout that shook heaven was not marked by war. It was marked by stillness, not peace, restraint. A pause too long held, a silence too loud to last. The mountain waited, the wind dared, and somewhere in the valley below, The fire that would become dragon-rend began to smoulder. It did not begin with fire. It began with mercy. Paarthurnax, brother to the end, breathed not to scorch, but to soften. His wings no longer cut through storm. They folded. His words, once born to rule, now trembled. He had learned what Alduin had never considered. That power must be earned backward, from silence to voice, not the other way around. And so he whispered, to the monks, to the mountains, to the sky. But the world was not yet ready for a whisper. It wanted thunder. In the east, a young warrior climbed the throat. His name is not recorded in scrolls, only in echo. He had seen a village burned, not by dragonfire, but by fear of it. A false sighting, a panic, old men blaming the wind. He had shouted once, long ago, in a canyon where no one watched. The rock split. A hawk fell from the sky. He buried that power, then climbed to ask, what do I do with this voice that can break a mountain but not save a child? Paarthurnax gave no answer. He only listened, and the silence that followed was so heavy, so filled with possible shape, that the warrior wept. He wept not from sorrow, but from recognition, and the wind carried that recognition down the mountain, into snow, into stone, into the blood of others who remembered what it meant to choose. That was the fracture, not a betrayal, not a shout, a choice. Soon others climbed, some with gifts, some with grief, all with questions. Paarthurnax welcomed none. He resisted none. He waited. And when they sat, when they stilled, when they felt their own breath tremble in their chests, only then did he speak. He taught them not what the voice could do. He taught them what it shouldn't. And in this, in restraint, taught by a dragon, the world shuddered, because the Thu'um, once chained to conquest, now found itself reframed, not as command, as covenant. But dragons are not one, and Alduin heard, not through word, through loss. For every mortal who sat and breathed with Paarthurnax, one less flinched at wing shadow, one less fed the fear that gave him weight. Alduin saw the mountain bend, not physically, but in allegiance, and he marked his brother, not with flame, with silence. A space opened between them, deep as centuries, a vow shattered not in scream, but in difference. Paarthurnax felt it, not in body, in memory. He had once burned cities beside his kin. Now he sat with monks, breaking bread, offering words instead of flame, and knew he had chosen exile from the only family eternity had given him. That was the second fracture. The first was choice. The second was cost. And with both, the world shifted, because now the voice was no longer bound by blood. It was bound by will. The first dragon-rend was not a shout. It was a gathering, not of soldiers, not of kings, of voices, voices that had knelt in silence, that had inhaled restraint, that had learned to mean what they said. It began in a cave with no light, where echoes folded upon themselves like wet parchment. 3 monks sat shoulder to shoulder. One had once been a jarl's son. One had never spoken before arriving. One had seen a dragon up close and lived. They did not plan to create. They planned to honor. But when they breathed in unison, 3 pulses, 3 vowels, 3 truths long kept quiet, the air around them tightened. It did not crack. It accepted. A word was born, not a dragon's word, a mortal one, never spoken before, and it hated flight. They carried it up the throat. Each syllable folded into their steps like blood in snow. Paarthurnax watched them come, and something in his eyes, golden, ancient, tired, flickered, not in warning, in grief, because he knew what they carried, and he knew what it would cost. They spoke it once at the summit, only once. The wind bucked, the sky dropped, the stone rippled, as if a second mountain tried to stand beneath the first. Far away, a dragon screamed and fell, not wounded, not burned, grounded. Its wings would not lift. Its chest seized, its breath caught, not from injury, from understanding. The word was Yor, mortal, not an insult, not a taunt, a reminder. To speak it was to say, you are not above us, you are with us, bound as we are, clay as we are. The dragons had ruled because they believed they were inevitable. Dragonrend made them accountable. It spread slowly, not as rebellion, as reality, a reality dragons had never faced. That mortals could speak with weight, with will, with enough truth in their ribs to bend heaven. Some dragons fled, some bowed, some tried to burn the word from the air, only to find their fire turned inward, choked by the very breath that once exalted them. Paarthurnax did not intervene. He watched, he mourned, and when the last syllable of the new shout was etched into stone at the mountain's peak, he exhaled once, a gust that scattered the snow and made even the monks flinch. It was not anger, it was farewell. The voice had changed, once an inheritance, now a trial, once blood-bound, now chosen, once a weapon, now a mirror. To speak now was to declare who you were, and to face it. The new shape was not louder, it was truer. The sky has never sounded the same. Even now, when storms gather over the reach, or blizzards crawl out of the pale, there is a pause, brief, brittle, before the wind speaks, as if the air must first check. Am I still free to move, or must I wait for the next word? Because it remembers. The shout that shook heaven did not just strike dragons from the sky, it made the sky mortal. In the high places, near the steps where pilgrims lose their names and breath, the stones still hold it. Not the word, not the syllables, the silence after. The monks do not teach Dragonrend. They speak of it as wound, not weapon, a breath too heavy to carry unless bound with compassion, a truth too sharp to voice without loss. They kneel before the tablet that holds it, not as keepers, but as witnesses. Because what remains is not just power, it is regret. Paarthurnax lives still in those days, in that chapter. He sits in the cold and waits for new questions. He speaks only when asked. He listens as if each syllable carries ash. Some call him coward, Some call him saint, but those who listen closely hear something coiled in his words. Not flame, not fear, forgiveness. Not sought, offered. He has not flown since Dragonrend was first spoken. Not because he cannot, because he chooses not to. Among the lowlands, in the mead halls and market stalls, children play a game. They stand facing each other, eyes shut, mouths open, waiting to see who speaks first. The first to speak loses. They call it holding heaven. They do not know why, but when the silence stretches just long enough, sometimes the fire in the hearth cracks backwards, and the elders glance toward the mountains, not in fear, in remembrance. The dragons have not returned in force, but neither have they vanished. They drift through legend like ghosts too proud to rest. When a roof caves inward without cause, when a torch gutters despite no wind, when a breath catches in your throat for no reason. Some say it is because one watches, one listens, one remembers what it felt like to fall. The Thuum is no longer theirs, nor is it truly ours. It belongs to the choice, the mortal act of inhaling what one could destroy, and exhaling instead what one must carry. Dragonrend remains carved into stone, but the deeper mark was made in hearts that chose not to shout. The world still tilts from that choice, and the hinge continues to turn. Skyrim forgot, not in a moment, inches at a time, a name dropped from a story, a word mispronounced, a shout no longer echoed in the high valleys. It wasn't silence, it was neglect, the kind that grows soft in peace, that lets dust gather over blade and prayer alike. The World-Eater slept not beneath earth or ice. He slept in assumption. The Thuum faded first. After Dragonrend, after the sky silence, the voice had become sacred again. Too sacred. Not forbidden, deferred. The Greybeards sat higher than memory. The people stopped climbing. Tongues were no longer trained. They were myths, mason marks carved into mountains that no child bothered to trace. Even the monks fell into ritual, their breath no longer curious, only measured. The gods too grew distant, not absent, just patient. Kyne's winds still circled the peaks, but she no longer called. Stoon's storms crackled out to sea. Shore did not rise, they waited, and the waiting grew too comfortable. Below, the hold swelled with smoke, and stories of war that had not happened in generations. Blacksmiths made blades with no name. Bards sang of the past, as if the future owed them no echo. The elder scrolls gathered dust in sealed towers. Their keepers whispered of murmurs, flickers in the parchment, but none dared open them, not truly, because prophecy only matters when you believe the end might still return. Then came Helgen, not a siege, not a war, a whisper, then a roar, then ash. One moment, the town prepared for execution, and in the next moment, shadow, flame, wings. Alduin did not announce himself. He simply resumed, not as villain, as pattern, but before that smoke, before the towers broke, there was a moment, so brief it did not mark itself, A chicken clucked, startled. A man turned to look at a cloud that did not belong. A breath caught in a soldier's throat and never came out again. The World-Eater did not wake. He returned, and Skyrim, too long unwatchful, greeted him not with shouts, but with screams. The scream at Helgen was not mortal. It bent trees. It pulled the breath from lungs. It cracked time, not enough to break it again, but enough to show the scar still pulsed beneath the world's skin. People fled, some died, some disappeared, not in fire, but in forgetting, swallowed by a shout that named them not worthy of remembering. And in the heart of that collapse, something strange happened. A soul turned. It rose from a dying throat, not with prayer, not with fear, but with recognition. It did not flee. It flew into another. A man, bound, watching, and when it struck him, it sang. This was not the shout of the old tongues, not the voice of the Greybeards, not even the echo of Paarthurnax's sorrow. This was something older and newer at once, the Dragonborn. Not a title, a pattern reawakened. Kine had not forgotten. She had merely waited. And now, as the sky cracked again, she breathed through another. The fracture was not just Alduin's return. It was the world's recognition that it had left the door open. The mountains no longer held silence. They began to echo differently. The stones of the old word walls pulsed again, not with memory, with urgency. Shouts long buried beneath snow rose like buried bones. Runes that had dulled through centuries of wind glowed with syllables too sharp to age. The voice was not coming back. It had been called. Alduin flew not as conqueror, as collector. Every death was a feast, every soul devoured, a return to an order he believed never should have been broken. And mortals, soft, slow, story-drunk, could not stop him, not with blade, not with fire, not even with prayer, because none remembered how to speak. None, except one. The Dragonborn began not with power, but with instinct, a reflex, a syllable spat before thought, a wall cracked, a body moved without being touched, and the Greybeards, watching from their cloud-wrapped perch, felt the mountain tremble, not in threat, in recognition. They sent for him, not with messengers, with wind. The shout rolled down the throat like a question held in thunder, and he climbed. This was the true fracture, not Alduin's return, not the souls devoured, not the fire, but Skyrim's memory reawakening in one living throat, a mortal, with the sky coiled in his ribs, the gift of a goddess, and the burden of a world that had forgotten how to fight with breath. He climbed with no song behind him. No bards trailed his shadow. No gods announced his coming. Only the wind knew his name, and it did not speak it. It waited. The throat of the world, long untouched by mortal ambition, felt his footfalls as tremors, not because he was heavy, because he was expected. Each step stirred the voice beneath the stone. Each breath he took, the air curled tighter, around ribs, around prophecy, around possibility. The Greybeards met him not as teachers, as witnesses. They bowed, and the mountain shivered. The new shape was not born in a moment. It emerged like frost over still water, slow, silent, and unmistakable. Wherever the Dragonborn walked, word walls stirred. Not all revealed themselves. Some cracked. Some exhaled dust. Some wept. The runes did not teach. They remembered, and he did not read them. He answered, not always in word, sometimes in stance, sometimes in silence. The stone knew, the shouts returned, not as gifts, as tests, each one cost. A moment of clarity, a scar pulled inward, a memory not his own, pressed like heat against the lungs. They were not powers, they were burdens carried forward, but he bore them. Because to shout was not to speak, it was to remember aloud, and the world began to reshape itself around that breath. Alduin felt it. With every word reclaimed, he grew uneasy. This was not rebellion. This was rhythm reasserting itself. The wheel had not stopped. It had tilted dash, and now it turned again with new weight. He burned harder, took more, tried to claw time back beneath his wings, but it was already spoken, not ended, answered. The hold stirred, not with armies, with listening. People leaned toward thunder with a different kind of fear, one shaped not by fire, but by memory, rising in someone else's voice. Children whispered names they shouldn't know. Priests felt their prayers rerouted mid-syllable. Even the winds over Windhelm began to stammer, as if too full of echoes. The land itself relearned how to breathe, and in that breath, the new shape solidified. The Dragonborn was not just return, he was mirror, to the gods, to the dragons, to Skyrim itself, a reflection of every silence once left unchallenged, and every shout yet to come. The sky does not sleep easily anymore. It flinches at dusk, at names half-spoken, at breaths drawn too sharply near mountain peaks, because it remembers the one who returned without time's permission, and the one who answered with soul and syllable. The Dragonborn did not finish the war. He carried it, not in fire, not in sword, but in the space between shouts, where breath becomes choice. He left no throne. He left paths, word walls, that glow differently now, not with power, with invitation. Each rune carries a resonance, not a command, a question. What will you speak into the sky when the sky listens back? And Alduin, he does not linger, not in wing, in pattern. Every age bears some echo of him, the hunger that devours tomorrow, the arrogance that assumes its own return. The Dragonborn did not destroy him, he interrupted him, and the wheel groaned as it spun. In Whiterun, the guards still speak of the firestorm that didn't land, a heat that passed overhead but left no ash. In Riverwood, an old woman lights incense every Sundays, not for the divines, but for a wing shadow that paused over her roof and then moved on. She doesn't know why. She only knows she lived. Children are taught not to shout near the mountains, not from fear, from reverence. Their elders say the air is thinner there. What they do not say, It is listening, waiting for the next name it must carry, the next syllable it must reshape. The Thuum is no longer hidden, nor is it hunted. It is held in vaults of flesh, in scrolls made not from paper, but from promise. The Dragonborn breathed into the world a rhythm it had forgotten it knew, that the voice can break, but also bind, that soul can burn, but also shine. What remains is not victory, not even safety. What remains is presence, a sky that watches, stones that murmur, and a wheel that for now turns forward, but slowly, carefully, as if wary of what still waits in the echo between ages. Before Sovngarde stirred, it sang, not loudly, not in words. Its halls echoed not with battle cry, but with remembrance so full it hummed, a place apart, not because it was distant, but because it was finished. Here the wheel did not turn, it rested. Heroes feasted not in revelry, but in completion. They ate with clean hands, drank with unburdened throats. Their scars had stories, not weight. In Sovngarde, the air was mead warm, the stone always slightly sunlit, even when no sky could be seen. Time did not move, it welcomed. The Hall of Valor stood not as fortress, but as echo's home. Shor walked its perimeter with bare feet, leaving no tracks. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, even gods hushed, because Shor's voice was not command. It was recognition. He greeted not titles, not feats. He named only truths carried across the veil. You are the one who stood alone on the bridge at dawn. You are the shield that broke, but did not fall. You are the promise kept at the cost of your name. The mead there held no taste of grain or honey. It tasted of release. Every sip a memory made light. Every toast a sorrow unsharpened. They did not forget. They simply no longer bled from the remembering. Songs were sung without pride, just clarity. Even the drums did not thunder. They resonated, as if played by heartbeat and silence in duet. But even Sovngarde has its gates, and even gates must open. Sometimes a breath too full finds its way in, not a soul yet finished, but one pulled forward by fate unspent. These are rare, twice in an age, 3 times in a myth, and when they come, the mist parts, the songs quiet, and Shor stands still, waiting to see if the one who comes carries not just story, but closure. This is the age before the last shout, the moment before the last scale falls, the hush in the halls of the honored, before even they must ask, if this is the end of the end, who will carry the echo home? The mist was not always there. It crept in. It wasn't storm that came. It was silence, deliberate, closing, final. At first, a thin veil over the stones, then thicker, then directionless. Warriors once able to find the hall by heart now wandered. Some turned in circles, some sat, some wept, not from fear, but from a loss of name. And the sky did not break. It withdrew, not a storm, a silencing. Sovngarde, realm of honor, became hollow. Shore stood unmoving. He watched the fog roll in and said nothing, because he knew this was not weather. This was debt, unpaid, old as breath, older than the wheel's first spin. Alduin had found his way in, not with fire, with right. Not all souls pass to rest by gift. Some carry weight that even death cannot shear. And Alduin, eater of worlds, of moments, of memory, had come to claim those left unspoken. He came through the mist, not as beast, but as absence. No wings, no flame, just the sound of names being unmade. A feast not of flesh, of significance. The honored dead began to fade. Not all, just enough. The ones whose shouts had gone unanswered, the ones buried without story, the ones whose heroism had become parenthesis in newer sagas. He swallowed not their deeds, their place, and Sovngarde, once the stillest hall, trembled. 3 heroes stood at the edge of the fog. Ysgramor, his axe scarred from battles he could no longer name. Feldir the Old, whose voice cracked even in this place, where time held no grip. Gormla, golden hilt, her blade humming low, like a string drawn too long across silence. They did not shout. Not yet. They waited, because the mist was listening, because Alduin was not hunting. He was calling, and only one voice could answer. Then the sky shook, not with thunder, with recognition. The Dragonborn had crossed the veil, not pulled by death, drawn by purpose. Shore opened the gate, not with a challenge, with a question. Are you ready to shout not for self, but for the world that will never see you again? And the answer did not come in words. It came in breath. Alduin turned in the mist, and the mist turned with him, because Sovngarde was not his domain, but the forgotten still belonged to him, until someone remembered them rightly. And so, at the edge of the world's last rest, the fracture split. The break wasn't in the land. It was in what could no longer continue. Sovngarde, the unmoved, now held motion, because something had entered it that did not belong. What entered Sovngarde was no death. It was choice, unburdened, deliberate, and alive. They did not charge. They breathed. 3 stood beside one. Ysgramor, Gormleth, Feldir. Blades drawn not in defiance, but in memory. And the Dragonborn, who had carried the weight of worlds, now stood where even gods went quiet. They did not shout to kill. They shouted to unmake forgetting. The shout did not burn. It cleared. Not flame, clarity. Not noise, recognition. Jor, Zar, Frul. Each syllable struck not bone, but claim. Mortal, finite, temporary, the very things Alduin denied. And for the first time, the Eater of Ages recoiled, not in pain, in disbelief, because here, in Sovngarde, where the dead should rest and the living should never stand, someone had spoken his end aloud, and the world had agreed. Alduin rose. His wings carried ash. His mouth dripped possibility undone. He opened his throat to reply. not with a shout, but with a scream so layered in histories it almost unraveled the hall itself. But they answered, together, not 3, 4. The Dragonborn did not lead, he joined. Their voices weaved, not as chorus, but as resolve bound across time, and the shout came not as blast, as weaving, sound as strand, breath as thread. They wrapped Alduin not in death, but in finality. He cracked, not like stone, like ice in spring, brittle and melting at once. Light poured from his joints, each flicker a timeline rejected, each flare a world he might have eaten, had the wheel not said no. And when his wings gave, he did not fall. He ceased, not to exist, to matter. The soul, once gluttonous, once infinite, scattered into story. And Sovngarde, which had bent around him, now stood still again. The fog receded, not banished, honored. The mist had held the memory of those nearly lost. Now it bowed away, and the dead remembered their names. The mead flowed again, the drums resumed, but softer, like breath released. Shore nodded, not to the Dragonborn, to the world. The hinge had turned, not closed, not opened, shifted, and in the echo left behind, the hall of valor grew quieter, not in sorrow, in peace, made whole. No one speaks as he leaves, not out of reverence, out of understanding. Sovngarde does not hold what is unfinished. The Dragonborn's path was not toward rest, it was through it. He turns from the hall without a backward glance, not because he forgets, because he remembers enough. The road out is not paved, it's mist and memory, winding where time once pooled. The dead do not follow. They've found their stillness, but the air follows him, not wind, not weather. Witness, even the stones beneath his boots feel quieter than when he came, as if they're grateful. When his foot touches snow again, it melts. One flake, one print, then the cold resumes. The mountain does not welcome him. It accepts. He is no longer its guest. He is its echo made flesh. In the valley below, nothing has changed. The holds still squabble. The banners still flap. Children still ask if dragons are real, and their parents still answer wrong. But the sky, it listens differently, not afraid, attuned. The wind avoids certain syllables. The sun hesitates just long enough at the peaks to acknowledge something past there, something that was never meant to return. The Dragonborn does not shout again, not for weeks, not for years. Some say he vanished. Others say he became a monk. A few say they hear his breath in the high passes, where avalanches refuse to fall. None of it matters, because he did not carry back power. He carried absence, the place where Alduin once was, the place where choice defied prophecy. And Sovngarde, it sings again, but not for him, for the silence he left behind. A silence shaped like a man who shouted once, and then let the world breathe without him. The wheel creaks forward, not loudly, but with weight, because the echo he carried was not his own. It was ours, and now we carry it as well.